Welcome to the Sober Circle channel.
It's funny when you do that because I don't know what you're saying to me, so I'm trying to answer appropriately. My name's Lynda, and I'm a member of Al-Anon. Hi, everybody. Step 4 and 5, I'm going to address them briefly just from the standpoint of Al-Anon, and then Bob will take over from the AA point. When I first came to Al-Anon, I had absolutely, positively no intentions of ever taking step 4 and 5. You didn't know that. I didn't make that clear to you, but that was the way it was going to be. I was not going to do them. I didn't need them. I was raised a Catholic. I had been many times to confession, and that's what this seemed like to me, and therefore I wasn't doing it. I didn't tell you that. As time went on, people started to assume that I had done steps 4 and 5 because I never corrected them otherwise, and I liked the fact that they assumed I had done them because it sort of let me off the hook. In a very funny way, it did, but in a very tremendous way, it didn't, because now I not only had not taken steps 4 and 5, but I knew what a phony I was, that I was lying to all of you, and so my dishonesty was even worse than not having even taken step 4 and 5. So finally, I decided I got in too much pain, and I thought I've got to work this program the way it's supposed to be worked. And I did 4, and then 3 weeks later did 5. And the thing that, I don't know if it's for sure harder for Al-Anons, because I'm not on both sides of that, but I think most of the time the Al-Anons I talk to, it's very difficult. It's very easy for them to find all their defects of character, but it's very difficult for them to find any assets. And I think that's part of what our illness looks like. We lose ourselves in the alcoholic. We lose who we are. And we don't even know what we like and what we don't like. And as far as do we have any assets, I remember going to Bob and asking him, because the woman who I went and did my 5th step with insisted that I write down assets. And I remember going to him and asking him if I had any. Isn't that sad? You know? But that's what our illness looks like. So I guess the main thing I want to say on 4 is I believe it's very important that you include the things that you've done that you're not so proud of, and the things that you've done that are your good points. So include, you know, your defects and your assets. I don't know if this is going on and off. I'll just talk loud. So I think for Al-Anons, we have to include both because it's very difficult. We tend to put ourselves down a whole lot more. And then for step 5, my first 5th step was pretty much what Bob talked about. You know, it was getting rid of sort of those big boulders, the big issues. And over the years, I've been able to do other 4th and 5th steps, and they've become more refined. I've taken a 5th step, 4th and 5th steps on our marriage, where I really looked at the aspects of our marriage, my part, his part, and what I could do to improve. I took a 4th and a 5th step on anger issues that I had around my mother, where I just focused on that. And I even took a 4th and a 5th step on aging. I don't like getting older. There were some issues that I was looking at that I didn't like about it. And so I went back to what I've been taught. This is how you get rid of things that don't work for you, and this is how you come to acceptance and how you come to see God in the situation. So I am now of the opinion that, you know, there was a woman in our group who used to say, it used to drive me crazy too, she'd always say, well, if you haven't taken a 4th step, why don't you try it before you say you don't need one? And oh, she irritated me, but now I really give you that same advice. If you haven't tried one, try it. It really will set you free. 4 and 5 are the steps that we come nose to nose with who we are, good and bad. We look at it honestly. It's knowing from my experience, I was in the program 7 years before I took a 4th step. It's a lot scarier in that place than it was after I took one. Now I'll turn it over to Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob. I'm an alcoholic. The question is, if you're married, do you have to do an inventory? Or do you have one done for you? I have done probably 8 inventories since I've been in AA. A lot of activity. And the first inventory that I've done wasn't very insightful. It was important, but it wasn't very insightful. It got rid of, but I look back on it, and it accomplished quite a bit. I had a lot of guilt around the behavior and conduct that I had prior to getting sober, and I relieved myself of much of that guilt in the process of doing the early 4th and 5th step, even though by the big book standards about whether I covered all the bases and did the columns correctly and had the right, words, I didn't. But I felt a great relief. Not only did I feel a sense of forgiveness, which I didn't expect, I really had a sense that the reason I went through that was because I was going to change. And it was kind of reminding myself why I was going about this process. I mean, I think that's good, that we, that if I was going to change, I really had to know what I was going to change. And my second 4th step was when I was about 5 years sober, and my third 4th step was when I was 7 years sober. And I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to talk about my big change, which is, I think, during 6 and 7, when we get into the 6 and 7 step. But as far as getting into the causes and conditions of the aspects of my sobriety, I didn't really understand the causes and conditions of my unmanageability in my sobriety until I was 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years sober. I didn't understand it at 3 years. You can't understand it all at 2 years or 3 years. The book says that doing the first 4th step is simply but a start in a lifetime process of doing an inventory. If this is a spiritual walk, if this is a process, if this is a spiritual awakening, we're going to be inventorying. We don't have to be anal about it. We don't have to be perfectionist about it, but we're going to be doing some sense of inventorying our whole life. I mean, one of the great assets that I think we have in recovery is if we have a healthy questioning of ourselves, not a neurotic questioning, not a, people say you're putting yourself down, you're demeaning yourself. You're not, some of the times the women's movement look at AA and said, this powerlessness is just a tool to keep women down. The different other organizations look at us and say you're too religious. I don't know how to answer other people's views of us, but from my point of view of recovery, having a balanced questioning. We are people who have lived we are flawed people. We have, many of us, our behaviors were way the heck out there. Bad, had bad consequences for us and had bad consequences for everybody around us. We're capable of rationalizing a very broad spectrum of behavior. And so we are people who should rightly question our thinking because we can rationalize a lot of things. Plus, how healthy it is to be able to run some of these things by our advisors. If you can do that, not only do you have a more open life, but you're going to get input, and you're going to be less likely to get isolated and way out there. So I think the process of inventorying is enormously important. We have, over the last number of years, AA has become much more formal in how it approaches a lot of things. There are kind of movements within organizations. Within all organizations, there tends to be a movement towards orthodoxy. Okay, you can see it in churches, you can see it in lots of different places. And I think I see that tendency in Alcoholics Anonymous. So in orthodoxy, there gets to be kind of a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And while our book is our basic text, I want to say that you can sometimes get too formal. You can sometimes get too rigid about how you do these things. As important as the form of what you do is the spirit of what you do. It's the heart that you bring to the matter. My sponsor was really big on an attitude. If he'd say, give me a person with a good attitude, and they can make mistakes. They don't have to do it. Everybody makes mistakes. I don't care if you have a good attitude or a bad attitude. You aren't going to do this thing perfectly. This is bigger than any of us. You can't contain this. So I'm going to give you my 5-minute lecture on orthodoxy. You are having a lot of people come to you and talk to you about the steps. You know, you've had Carl, and you've had who? Sharon and Kate, Sharon and Casey, and lots of, and you had Karen Nord, who's in my AA group at home, and so I know all these people are good friends of mine, and I know them. But over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, you are going to have 15 or 20 people come to talk to you about the steps. And if you went to a big convention in the United States, and you went back to the table where they sell tapes, you'd have all these different people teaching on the steps. Well, when I came in, we didn't have any of that. And yet we had good recovery. Things were not as structured as they are today, and we had good recovery. There's a tendency, so some people would give you the impression that all you need to know in life is 164 pages, and your life will be complete. That's not my view. I think this is the menu. You can starve to death eating the menu. You need the food. The food is of God. The food is spiritual. You might never find the food if you don't have the directions. So don't hear me. I don't want to make it sound like I don't want the directions. I want the directions, but it's a description. As the holy man said, when the master points to the moon, all the idiot sees is the finger. The finger is not the object. The moon is the object. So we get the impression that all you need is the right instructions, and it will all be okay. Well, if the steps were mechanical, every time you had a problem, all you'd have to do is say the third step prayer and click your heels, and you'd be back in Kansas. There'd be no problems. Well, sometimes when you say the third step prayer, no one's home. It's not mechanical. God doesn't answer just when you ring the bell. That's childish to think that you can somehow reduce these profound spiritual principles to mechanics. Now, it's better doing them mechanically than not doing them. So don't listen to me say don't do them mechanically. I've done them mechanically. When you're dry and you're having a tough time and you're down, do them mechanically. Because that's all you can do. You bring what you have. You'd have to, But there's something you have to bring to the process of doing the steps beyond the form. And it's something to do with your heart. It's something to do with your integrity. It's something to do with your honesty. It's something to do with your openness. It's something to do with humility. It's something to do with teachability. But it's more a matter of the heart. The process of the steps and the process of recovery is a process of being, not doing. Most of us want to know what to do. The doing will come when you alter your being. Your being gets altered when you are touched by God, when you are touched by love, when you are touched by the program. Who you be changes. Time and time again, give me those glasses, right? Time and time again in the program, the book talks about, on page 25, the great fact for us is nothing less that we have had a deep and effective spiritual experience which has revolutionized our whole attitude towards life, towards our fellows, and towards God's universe. This is transformational. This is just not a linear change. 1, 2, 3. It's 1, 2, 8,000. It is a very big deal. When Silkworth talks about early on the deal, this is very early in the program, and Silkworth talks about, he's talking about unless an entire psychic change can take place, there's little hope. And then he says, on the other hand, strange as it may seem to those who don't understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself able to control his desire for alcohol, the only effort be necessary to follow a few simple rules. Suddenly. It is when these things happen of God, it is like we're different. We're not the same people. And when it's and when it's changed, you can see it. You can see it in the eyes of the people. You can, we used to joke in treatment. You'd tie a guy up and you'd put him in the trunk of the car. You'd drive him out, and he'd spend the first 2 weeks planning how to kill his wife if he ever got out. But in the third week, something happens, and all of a sudden, he's talking to the new person. He's helping them. He's volunteering stuff that he was hiding. Very different. Not the same man. Just in a week. Very different. So, the impact of the program comes from God, comes from the spirituality, comes from a power greater than ourselves, not from the form. The form is an assistance. The form leads you to the place to do the work, but the work is not the form. Now, so in saying that, the best way is to engage yourself with the form. Okay, but have some freedom, have some play in that process. So for us to, if we're going to get our lives in the kind of shape and find happiness and balance and wholeness in our lives, we need to know what's wrong. In order for us to find out where our flaws are, where our defects of character, where our shortcomings are, what doesn't work, inventorying is the process. The most conservative members of Alcoholics Anonymous think God wrote the big book, and Bill Wilson wrote the 12 and 12 in his office. That the big book is the real thing, and the 12 and 12, okay. I don't believe that. I believe that what we have is Bill Wilson with 4 years of sobriety writing the book. I believe that he was guided. No one's smart enough at 4 years of sobriety to write with the depth. I am a student of Eastern philosophy, and I read a lot of different spiritual and religious material. It just comes back and back and back how wonderfully written and how profound and how wise what Bill Wilson wrote. And I believe, from every fiber of my body and from my experience, that he was guided. I also believe that when he wrote the 12 and 12, 7 years later, even though it was published in 1953, he wrote it in 1946 when the Grapevine started as a series of articles, and it didn't come out as a book until afterwards, that he was talking about just trying to deepen the instructions that we had in the book. And you can see different influences on those things. So the same man who wrote the 4-step in the big book wrote a very different 4-step inventory in the 12 and 12. So obviously he didn't think there was only one way to do it. With that said, most of us today follow the instructions in the big book and do the columns. You do the columns on fears and on resentments, and the columns on fears and the columns on sex, and we do the 4th column to talk about what was our part, which is what we're trying to do when you go through. If I have a criticism of being too formal, what I find is some of these young people, when they come to me today, I feel like it's an artificial process sometimes. I feel like when they've given me their 5th step, it's too rigid. I don't feel like I get to know them. I don't feel like they've dumped the whole load. They're using only the words that are described in the book. And I'm saying that if you were telling me your story, you'd use more words. Don't restrict yourself to only the words in the book. Use the words in the book, but use your own words so that you can tell me what hurts, what's wrong, what doesn't work, what are you afraid of. I want to know both those things so you do it. So don't restrict yourself. Go through that. So the 4th and 5th step are, I think, the great rites of passage in the program. I think all of us feel more of a member when we have done the 4th and 5th step. We feel like more grown up. We feel like we really belong. We now have our spot when we've done the 4th and 5th step. That's a big piece of work. That's kind of one of the real initiations, the 1st step being maybe the key initiation, but the 4th and 5th step are like that in rites of passage. In our country, the 5th step, and then I wanted to talk briefly about one other thing. Well, I'm going to send up a pamphlet that is one of the things that we now see going around are what are called step workshops. And People will tell you that they started in different ways. My understanding how some of this started is that there's a old-timer by the name of Cecil Corrigal and his sponsor, they kind of co-sponsored each other, Elmer. They both had about 53 years. Elmer just died, from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in Canada. And in order to do some of the prison work, Elmer wrote out these mimeograph sheets that referred to the big book. You know, read the doctor's opinion, and then it would ask you a series of questions on the doctor's opinion. Those got passed around through Denver and through some active young people and all over the country. And then about 10 years ago, Dr. Paul, who's, you know, the stories in the big book, Dr. Alcoholic Addict, Dr. Paul published them in a little pamphlet. And he refers to his friend in Texas who sent him a lot of this material. And what it is a 16-week workshop on the steps using the big book. The way we use it, and I don't know if everybody does it the way we do it, but the way we do it is we get 10 to 20 people. Now, although right now one of the groups is 70. And we say, look, we're going to go through the steps. We're not going to read about them, we're going to take them. Okay, we're going to do the work that's in this pamphlet. Okay? And once you're in this group, you're in. I don't want you to say that you're coming here and then don't come. You say you're in this group, you're in. Once we start the group, no one can get in the group. So after the first meeting, maybe between the first and second, but after the second meeting, If you attend this group, you promise you will do it one more time to help someone else. Now, you want some old-timers in the group. You want some people who've got 8 years and 10 years and 12 years. And then you want not just everybody new, but it works no matter, because the instructions, are in the book. It is pretty good. And then we go through, and where the book says to kneel, we kneel. When the book says to pray, we pray. When the book says we admitted we were powerless, we admit that so we actually use the words and do the work as we go through the book. When we get to the fourth step, there's about 4 weeks or 5 weeks in the book to do the fifth step, or the fourth step. We do not do the fifth step with each other. You make an appointment with your sponsor or whoever you're going to take the fifth step with. So there isn't that sort of violation. But what happens is you bond. You get closer during that process. And it's a great process for people who are kind of having a flat spot. It just picks you up. It just gives you like a steroid shot or something like that. It just kind of does that. And I'm going to send a couple of those pamphlets up here, and that'll give you another option. So the fourth and fifth step are, I love what the book says. It says, up until this time you've had some ideas of God. Now you start to have an experience of God. When you are done with your fifth step, the barriers, when I talked about I tore down my wall, that completed the tearing down of my wall. I no longer had a barrier between me and you. And I was starting to restore my life. I was starting to restore my relationship with my God, my relationship with myself, my relationship with you. It is an enormous passage. It is the opening of the door, I think, for the whole second half of the program. It is the first half we kind of, powerlessness and surrender, hope, in the second step, and then turning our will over the care of God. And frankly, the program rests on how well those 3 steps. And I just want to say one other thing. Sometimes there's a tendency in the modern program, I think, to keep going back to step 4 and 5 when things are bad. And what I find is most of us have the information that's in 4 and 5. We know what's wrong. We don't need necessarily more inventory or more information. We have the information. We need to change. What we often don't have is step 1, 2, and 3. And the reason that nothing moves when you go back to an inventory, when I just go back to step 4, is because 1, 2, and 3 are not alive at that moment. If you really want things to move, you should go back and find out whether 1, 2, and 3 are alive when you go to do 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. Because if 1, 2, and 3 are not alive, when you do 4 and 5, you're not going to get any result out of 6. You are not probably going to get the whole result that you might hope to have in 6 and 7.
Why don't you do 6 and 7? Because they're so good.
I'm going to rush ahead and do 6 and 7, then Lynda can add 2. What I want to add to this, and this is kind of funny, usually when I do this weekend, I give my talk Friday night, and people know more details of my life. Today, we don't have that format, so it's kind of awkward because I'm going to give my talk tonight. And but I had a second spiritual experience at 8 years of sobriety. I was a very active member of I have always been a very active member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've always gone to 4 or 5, 6 meetings a week, always had a sponsor, tried to do the steps, sponsor people, active in service. But my first 6 or 7 years in AA, my life was horribly unmanageable. I had problems at work, with finance. I had a gambling problem, kind of a hobby. 4 or 5 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week. It wasn't a big deal. And, but I was making about $10,000 a year playing backgammon. I was kind of a semi-professional backgammon player. And I had issues with marriage, we were arguing about how life was going, and I had issues with my children, as I said to you, that I was angry and sometimes violent, physical with my children. I had those problems throughout my entire first 6 or 7 years of sobriety. I worked on them pretty hard. I want to be a good man, and it was frustrating as heck for me to keep doing these things as poorly as I continued to do them. And I'll tell you, at 7 or 8 years of sobriety, I was in trouble. I was thinking about suicide. Not a joke, not sort of, I was tired. I was tired. It gets old. I felt like I could write the book on what to do. I just couldn't do it. It gets frustrating knowing the answer. So, as I said earlier, I was stuck in that place where I thought I had to change before I could ask God's help. Because I thought God would, if I went to ask God's help, he'd say, change. I'd say, try that, I can't do it. Help me some other way. He said, I can help you some other way. So I thought I'd have to do the change first. So I did another out of desperation, I went back to step 1 and found out what 1 meant to me 8 years sober. I was powerless again. I was unmanageable. I rediscovered step 2. I came to believe God was going to restore Bob, not you, not us, Bob, to sanity. I started to see people with bigger problems, with smiles on their faces, with great dignity, walking through walls that I was trying to avoid. And I came to believe God was going to restore Bob. I took the 3rd step, on my knees with my sponsor in his office. We didn't do that much in those days. So, that was different, but I thought I'm going to do it, the whole way. I did a 4th step, and I did my 3rd, 5th step. And the previous 2 I had done with clergy, and this one I did with my sponsor. And I said, when you're done, be careful, because I'm going to do whatever the heck I said, I feel like I'm dying of thirst lying next to a lake. I said, I feel like there's a plastic shield between me and the water. And when I was done, he sent me to a psychologist. And I didn't want to go to a psychologist. But I had a lot of issues around money and failure and work and success. I had a very successful father, and I thought I'll never be as good as my father. So I had a lot of mixed up stuff. And I didn't want to go, but I said I'd do whatever he recommended I do, and I went to a psychologist. And then the psychologist wanted to get my parents involved. I said, no, I won't do that. He wanted to get Lynda involved. I thought, oh, crap. It just gets confusing and maybe more honest than I wanted it to get to. When your wife's there, it's pretty hard to deny what the unmanageability is. When you're going alone, you can manage it a little bit. And what I mean, I don't have enough time, and I'll get into it with my... Are we supposed to stop at 2:15 or something?
She said 2:15, 2:30.
Okay, give me that coffee. What I got into it with the psychologist is what I made a discovery was how afraid I was. Now, at this point, I am 32 years old. I'm married with 2 children. I'm in a psychologist's office with my wife and those 2 kids. I'm about to go bankrupt in a job. I don't know why. I'm busting my ass an hour or 2 a day. And it's not working. And I'm in as much debt at 8 years of sobriety as I was when I came in the program. And I'm in trouble. And I'm an active guy. Okay, I'm trying to do the deal. I just don't look too good. And I made a discovery as how afraid I was. Now, you'd think, having done 3 inventories and 3 fear inventories, a couple of fear inventories, but that was dogs in high buildings and snakes. I had no insight into, and this guy got me in touch with how afraid of failure I was. And I'll tell you something, if you can't fail, you can't play. You can't play. I was the guy that if we were going to run a marathon, I'd have a great pair of shoes and a great pair of shorts, and I'd look and talk and act like a runner. When the race took off, you'd think I was going to be in the top 10. I'd tell you that I won some race in Minnesota. And for the first third of the race, I'd be up in front. But then somewhere between a third and halfway through the race, I'd fall down and hurt myself, and I'd stop. When the race was over, someone would say, "What happened to that guy from Minnesota?" I'd say, "Oh, I don't know. He pulled a hamstring or something." Hell of a runner. God, he was up in the, you should know, won some race in Minnesota. But if you would have followed me around in a helicopter in my life the preceding 10 years, you could have guessed within 50 feet when I would have fallen down, because I don't finish anything. I'm a great starter, but I don't finish anything. And I'll tell you something, that gets old. It gets old for your wife, it gets old for your parents, it gets old for you, and it just gets old. To have a lot of talent and not be able to put it on the street and use it over an extended period of time gets old. To not be able to use your gifts gets old. And I realized at the moment I was in that office that I was afraid of being a father. I was afraid of being a husband. I was afraid of the responsibility. I was afraid of success. I was afraid of failure. I was swimming in fear and didn't know what. I'd done 3 inventories and didn't know how afraid I was. And I went home to after I did that 4th and 5th, now I'm at the psychology, I went home and I had had a horrible day. And I realized that I had tried as hard as I knew how to try to change. And I'd failed. And for some reason, the thought occurred to me that was okay. Maybe that was where I was supposed to be, and I was allowed to take the 6th and the 7th step of the program of AA. The 6th step said, we're entirely ready to have God, not Bob, God, remove our defects of character. The 7th step said we humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. I had spent 8 years trying to get rid of them. I don't have the power to get rid of them. It happens through me, not by me. I am the pipe, not the well. I am not the source. I'm the vehicle through which the power comes through. A farmer doesn't grow. He plants the soil, creates a fertile environment, creates a place where growth can take place, and God grows. A doctor doesn't heal. He creates an aseptic environment, creates an atmosphere in which healing can take place, and God heals. And we don't change. We create an atmosphere in which change can take place, and God changes us. When you're ready for change, it's like it falls off you. It just goes away. Suddenly. It goes away. When you can see through it, when your consciousness gets raised in the process of doing these steps, you look at these things and they aren't treasures anymore. They're dog turds wrapped in gold tinfoil. They are not treasures anymore. You see through them, and they just go away. And that's what, to me, the process of change. Pretend for a moment, I don't know what I'm going to do in my talk or what I'm going to do here, but I want you to know something about change. If I ask most of us to raise your hands, and I'm not asking you to raise your hands, and say how many people would like to get rid of the things in their life that doesn't work and that hurts people, most of us would raise our hands. Well, I want to tell you something. That's not as true as you think it is, okay? Pretend for a moment that I'm working with a 38, 40-year-old guy, married with children, and he's doing the 4th step and he's having trouble with all the columns. And I say, Bill, don't worry about it. I said, that's complicated. Don't worry about it. Get your wife and your 2 kids and your mom and dad, your mother-in-law, your boss, a couple of guys from your AA group, and your brothers and sisters, and bring them over to the house. And here's what I want you to say. We have a step in AA which helps us get in touch with our defects of character, and I'm having trouble identifying mine. And I'm wondering if you would help. And then hand out tablets and leave. You'd have a pretty good start on an inventory, wouldn't you? Okay. But most of us would not call that meeting. Do you know why? We don't want to change. But it's worse than that, baby. Worse, we don't want to know. We train each other about what you can tell us and what you can't. If you're married, you train your wife. You can say, we're not talking about that. You understand? We're not having that. We are not having that conversation. You want to have that conversation? It's going to be a very expensive conversation for you to have. Nod your head up and down if you understand. We are not having that conversation. Okay? Your children know what they can say and what they can't say. The people you work with know your bullshit and know what they can say and what they can't say. Okay? Your friends know what they can say and what they can't say. There's stuff that they know what's okay to talk about, what's on the table, and there's stuff that's not on the table. Okay? So we are not as open to change as we think we're open to change. When I was first in the program, I could try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and still grow. But there comes a time where you got to change if you're going to grow. There comes a time when you get to a spot where you're at the fork in the road where it's time. You don't need to inventory. You don't need any more information. You don't need to do any more step work. You need to change. And if you don't change, you then go out and build an addition onto your house to accommodate the problem. The chasers hang out with the chasers, the gamblers hang out with the gamblers, and they make a deal. I won't call you on your crap. You don't call me on mine. Deal? Bad deal. I got just the opposite deal with my friends. If I'm out of line, call me. Call me and tell me that if I've done something that's really kind of stinky, call me and tell me. That's the kind of deal I've got. I've got guys that if they heard something, they'd be on the phone calling me, checking it out. Okay? We are afraid. We so identify with some of our defects of character. We think who we are. They aren't who we are. They're just behavior. They're not skin and bones. It's just behavior. You can change your behavior without changing who you are. You can change your political party without changing who you are. You can change your car. You can change your behavior. It isn't who you be. It's what you do. So the reason that a lot of us do not have the results in the process of change and growth that we want is we're afraid. We're afraid to stand in front of. You know, when I first came to Alcoholics Anonymous and took step one, I stood naked in front of my alcoholism. And it was never the same. I drank twice, but it was not with freedom. At 8 years of sobriety, I stood naked in front of my life. I thought, that in some ways I felt like a victim. I don't know how the hell I felt like a victim. And I saw that I had created all these problems that I thought I was a victim of. I designed my life the way it was. I protected my right to gamble. I protected my right to do AA activity when I should have been doing family activity. I protected my right to do all sorts to spend money whenever the hell I wanted to spend money, to do whatever I wanted to do. I didn't want that up for change. I wanted my business success to change, but I didn't want certain of my personal preferences to change. And it scared me that in order to change, I might have to put it all up on the counter. I didn't want to put it all. I wanted to pick and choose. And I think what I was afraid of is that life would be dull or no fun or not what I wanted or not enough or I don't know what. But I'll tell you, when you get it going the way it's supposed to be going, there's no shortage. There's abundance. There's joy. I mean, it is better than the other way has ever been. I've never had it all together, but my life substantially is more together today and more in balance today and more in peace today than it has ever been. And it's great. It is, there just isn't, I'm in love with my wife. I mean, that's great. It's not perfect, but it's great. It is, that's a nice thing. It's a nice thing for our kids. I have a good relationship with our children. But I want you to know how afraid of change I often am, and you often are. And sometimes we don't know that. We think in our heads, I'm ready to change. And you're dealing with the same monster that kept your alcoholism and drug dependency intact for a hell of a long time. You are more conflicted around change than you think you are. And sometimes you have to go back and examine that, and it takes a courage for us to confront. There's a great book. I usually don't recommend other books, but I'm going to do what I probably shouldn't do. There's a Buddhist nun by the name of Pema Chodron, and she has a Buddhist monastery in Nova Scotia, and she wrote a book called Places That Scare You. And it's about being a spiritual warrior. And the idea of a spiritual warrior is a person who can stand in front of what they're afraid of. And I think that speaks to those of us who are in the program of AA and growing, that we regularly are asked to, if we're doing inventory and we're listening to the world and we're listening to our family, because if God wanted to get a message to you, how would he get it to you? Bad news, probably your spouse, maybe your parents, maybe your employer, maybe your kids, but he's going to use the people you're in relationship with. Okay? And most of us are afraid to listen to the message. It takes a courage to grow. It takes courage to change. It takes courage to stand naked in front of the unworkability of your life. But most of us know that what we're afraid of is an illusion. Most of us know that the way to spiritual growth is through the fire, not around it. The fire is an illusion. There is no pain in change. There's only pain and resistance to change. That's a quote from Clancy that I stole. But there is no pain in change. But we fear change. We fear loss of the known. So the engine of our program, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and we'll get into 8 and 9. Do you want to finish 6 and 7? Okay. It's 2 o'clock. You want to start 8 and 9, or yes? We're going to do a little on 8 and 9, and then you said 2:15, did you not? What? Okay. So we're going to go to 2:15 on 8 and 9, and then we're going to do questions and answers. Is that okay? All right. Step 8 and 9. Made a list of all people we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. One of the other things when I talked about when we're doing step 4 and 5 that we need to remember is if you focus too much on just the form, there's 2 things you want to get out of that. You want to get out of it a list of your defects of character, so when you get to step 6 and 7, you know what you're asking. What you're asking to get ready to have removed, and you're asking for God to remove. It would be good that we have that list out of our 4th and 5th step experience, and it may take a little bit more work. Also, it would be good to have an 8th step list come out of our 4th and 5th step. So keep that in mind when you do, most of us who have been around a little bit, but a lot of times we do that like we're not even thinking about what comes later. We're not thinking about the list, and when we get to the 8th step list, we either have to go back, or if we don't have our 4th step, we go back. So I like to try to have some sort of sense that when I'm doing my 4th and 5th step, that when I'm done with it, that I'm going to have my 6th step list and my 8th step list. In order for us to do an 8th step list, made a list of the persons we have harmed and became willing to make amends to them all, there has to be a change of heart. Because most of us come in here and we feel for whatever reason we've been a victim. Not everybody, but I did. And I don't even know why. I was loved, I was taken care of, but you feel like you're a victim of circumstance and bad luck or bad breaks, and you hang on to you need a way to explain why you haven't done much with your life, and you think, oh, if this would have happened, if I would have gotten that break, I would have been okay, and we don't want to take responsibility for our lives. It's just too harsh, it's too painful for us to stand up and say, I goofed it up. I didn't, I didn't do it well. So the 8th and 9th step are, to me, the get out of jail free cards. And sometimes I think that they are underutilized today in the program. I think that they are the place that if you don't complete your 8th and 9th step, I think you are locking up a lot of energy that you need to live your life. If I were to borrow $3,000 from, what's your name? First mistake. Okay, I got to say that again. Yes. No, their first name, Vermin? I'm having trouble. Goodman? Okay, I'm having trouble. I'm sorry. I'm going to go back to Sicky. Excuse me. I don't have a good ear for language. If I were to borrow $5,000 from Sicky, okay, and assume that he was a pretty well-off guy and had a fair amount of money and he can lend me money, and I tell him, I need $5,000, I'll give it back to you. My tax return is coming back in 3 months. So let's say he lends me the money, okay? Big mistake. He lends me the money, and then I don't pay him back, all right? Well, the first thing I've got to do is as soon as it comes time for me to pay him back, I start missing meetings because I don't want to be in the meetings where he is, okay? Then I've got to kill him because he bothers me. So I go around and say, he's kind of a jerk. He's got a lot of, he doesn't need the money. I start saying negative things about him so that I somehow neutralize him so it doesn't bother me in my mind. Then I stop going to the group. So I lose my AA meeting, okay? And let's say 2 years pass, but every time his name comes around on the carousel of my mind, you can just see my lights dim, okay? My battery just drains. Well, alcoholics don't have one of those, okay? We've got 20 of those, okay? Little black holes that suck our soul, that suck energy, that suck light out of our spirit. And those incompletions drain us. And I think if you wonder why sometimes people who have a lot of talent but are unable to do much with their talent, there are a lot of people in AA like that. I think many times it's because they have not completed steps 8 and 9. They're afraid of it. They don't think they have enough money. They don't, whatever the explanation is. They haven't gotten to the point where they're responsible enough to own up to what they have done. And that takes, what happens when you can own it, you can change it. You can take responsibility for it. Your integrity gets restored. Your wholeness gets restored. Now, when I give him back, and maybe it's not giving him back the whole $5,000. Maybe it's going back to him and saying, I was wrong, I'm sorry, here's $500, and I will give you $50 a week for the next 3 years, or whatever, however, okay? I haven't even totally paid him back. But the moment that I made the list and knew that I was willing to go through that process, I started to be free immediately, not when it was done. I knew men that took 8 or 10 years. We used to have parties for people who paid their bills. We'd go out and celebrate. We'd go out and have coffee and ice cream after the meeting because I remember Mark, it was about 8 or 9 years for him to pay off his amends. And remember, I was newly sober and I thought, holy cow, it took him 8 or 9 years. I thought, that's a lifetime. I'm 24 years old. And I thought, but what dignity there is for the persistence of that man to keep taking the amount of money and doing that over that period of time. I don't know what his list was or how much money it was, but I know that I can still remember the day and still remember the celebration that we had. And I can remember when I got my amends paid off the first time, it was a very big deal. When you do that, the energy that was being sucked into those little holes, there's energy in completions. When you complete something, when you go clean the garage, when you clean your closet, you create an energy. It's the same thing in your life. When you clean up an area of your life, it's like something gets created in that process, and that energy becomes available for you now to live your life. Before, it's amazing that we have the energy to get dressed. We get all these little black holes that were holding us down and going back. So I really think that the 8th and 9th step, it is the prima facie evidence that you have had the change of heart necessary to undertake the work of the program. You've admitted your powerlessness. You've turned your will and your life over to the care of God. You've inventoried what's wrong. You've shared it with another person, and now you're going to make the wrongs right. And when you've done that, your work is done. Now you just continue. Now you go through the maintenance steps. Now you just keep going forward. But the bulk of your work is done. The promises follow in the book, the main promises that we talk about in the book follow steps 8 and 9. But I think today there's an overemphasis on 4 and 5 and an underemphasis on 8 and 9 because we're more intellectual. We want more information. And I think we have more information than we're willing to admit. And the core, and also today I would like to say that I think sometimes we are too psychological. The list of 8 and 9 get too long. We go back to high school and remember every little thing that someone did to us or we did to someone else. And you can get a little neurotic going through this list. And I think a little common sense is good. And, but I think there's a power, the power of completion and the restoration of your integrity. And when you restore someone, I have watched, a half a dozen guys that I sponsor go through this process, and when they've completed it, they're different men. They're different men. And people treat them differently. I know people who, prior to this process, that people used to give a bad time to all the time. And when they went through this process, they were no longer people you could give a bad time to. They just were bigger people than they were before. And because something got restored, something got returned to them in that process, and invariably they were able to go on and do better things with their lives than they had been able to do up till then. So there's some very good stuff.
Well, in Al-Anon, we do the same thing. We have hurt people either by committing some crime or act against them, or because of our anger, self-pity, isolation, we've withdrawn from people for no reason at all, and these people don't know what's happened. So we have to take a look at, from our list, from our 4th and 5th step, the people that we have harmed by our behavior. I think it's real important to remember that 8 and 9 come at position 8 and 9. I didn't pay attention to that the first time because, as I said, I wasn't going to do 4 and 5, and there were a couple of other ones I wasn't going to do either. And but I thought maybe I could do 8 and 9. So I sort of jumped into 8 and 9 because I wanted to do something. And the good news was I didn't do any harm to anybody, but I could have. I really could have. I think 8 and 9 come in that position exactly the right place, because then you're supposed to have steps 1 through 7 under your belt completed. And also you will have at that point hopefully a sponsor, someone that you would check out. I think we need to make the list, but I think we need to check that list with our sponsor. Where it says to make amends wherever possible or whenever possible. That's something that I think needs to be discussed, because you don't want to create more pain by making your amends. If I've gossiped about you, it is not appropriate for me to come up to you, in my opinion, and say, I've been gossiping about you for 8 years. Boy, I'm really sorry about it. But my job in that situation is not to tell you. My job in that situation is not to gossip. is to change my behavior and then maybe do some kindnesses for you for the reason that I have harmed you, but not to open a wound that you don't even know you have. So I think there's some real importance in the positioning of these steps and also in checking them out with your sponsor, because I don't think I had the wisdom that my sponsor had, and she was able to help me do some sorting. So anyway, I got to 8 and 9, and I had a list, and I made amends to those people. And then we're a step group in our group, so every week we do a different step. So every 13 weeks, we come around to 8 and 9 again. And every time I would get to 8 and 9, I would just say the prayer that if there's somebody who I have not cleaned up, please let that me become.
3 or 4 things.
Stop it. I sort of get on a roll and then laugh. Behave. So I say that prayer, and probably around 10 years into my program, and I don't know the timing and it's not important, this woman that I worked with her name was Helen, and she started to come up, sort of like bubbling up. And I would say, no, there's no reason. I didn't do anything to harm that woman, but it wouldn't go away. And finally I realized, after praying about it and talking it over, that I needed to make amends to this woman. This was a woman that I worked with when I taught in a college situation. And she was probably about 10, 12 years older than I was. And she was the head of the department, and I worked underneath her. So I would pick up the slack. When she wouldn't teach, I would teach. But she was having some gum surgery, and she wasn't teaching as much as she could. So I was taking over. But rather than just taking over, I was puffing myself up and making myself look more important. And by doing that, I was putting Helen down. And I knew that it was dirty and ugly, and I didn't like myself for it, but she really didn't know about it. Then I started to look at things, and I realized in some ways I think she did know about it. But, should I really call her? I mean, do I want to open up an old wound? Do I want to open up a wound anyway? Well, finally it became clear that I needed to. And one day I was reading the Sunday paper, and they had an article on how to do something crazy with geraniums. And Helen did the same thing with geraniums. And I thought, all right, I'm going to call her. So I knew exactly where she lived. I knew her last name. Looked it up. Maybe it won't be there. Maybe she'll have an unlisted number. Well, she had a listed number. So I called her up, and I said, told her who I was, and we chatted for a little bit, and then sort of reconnected. And I said, Helen, I have something I have to tell you. And so those times when you were having the gum surgery, I was catty, and I was making myself better at your expense. And I feel really badly about this, and I want you to know that I was wrong. And it's something that I'm not proud of, and I'm really sorry for the pain that I did cause you. And she said, she also had known that we were in AA and Al-Anon at the time, and she knew that Bob did speaking. And she said to me, are you doing a 9th step? I said, well, yeah, I was. She said, first of all, I accept what you've said. She said, but I want you to know that I wasn't having gum surgery. I was taking all those mints because I was drinking about a quart of vodka a day. And I am now sober in AA. And I understand what you're doing, and I totally accept that. And I'm really grateful that you called. And so we talked for maybe another 30 minutes or something, and it didn't have to go that way. She could have gotten angry with me and hung up, and I would have been okay. But you never know, do you? And I am so grateful that she kept coming up on my carousel, because if I hadn't paid attention to that, I never would have had that wonderful experience. And I was retelling, my people in my group say, tell us the Helen story. Sometimes if someone hasn't signed up for Step 9, and so they'll look at me and they'll say, tell us the Helen story. I told it about maybe 3-5 months ago, and I can't remember her last name anymore. And I thought, you know why I can't remember her last name? Because I don't have to know her last name anymore. She lived in Bayport. She probably still lives there. But I don't have to know her last name because I am clean with Helen. So every time we come around to step 8 and 9, I say that same prayer. And I've had one other thing pop up, and I've taken care of it too. I hope nothing else pops up. But I'm going to keep, we're going to talk afterward. I think I'm going to be busy for a while. But I'm going to keep saying that prayer because I want to stay clean. I want to have my energy for my life. And I agree so much with Bob that these holes, whether it be clutter in our house, which we're also talking about, trying to, eliminate these areas that we have piles that grow up around us in our home, and we're trying to really work on that. Or whether it's people, relationships, we need the energy to live our lives. Our lives are important. This is not a dress rehearsal. And I want to have all the energy I can have to be present to the day. And 8 and 9, what'd you say, is it let you out of jail cards? Or they give us freedom. And we need that for our lives. Okay.
So we're going to do questions management.
There you go.
Ég nú út að láta körfuna ganga.
Thanks for listening. Please support the channel by liking and subscribing.